joined us. Today we are hearing from our own Nick Chandler. The Chandler family has been a part of Prodigal for a few years now, and Nick is a faithful volunteer in our preteens classroom and has graciously offered to stand in for John as the Richardsons have some vacation time. Last week we concluded our series, The Me You Don't See. We had a great 3 weeks looking at mental health. The goal was to destigmatize, provide resources, and equip ourselves with the tools and permission to pursue professional mental health help. It doesn't stop with those 3 weeks. If you ever have questions or need help, please reach out to us. We have so many qualified people who can help point you and your loved ones in the right direction. Last week was our summer kickoff party here at Prodigal, and the youth raised over $700 washing our cars for us. Thank you so much to everyone who drove their cars through and donated money. The money you raised will help our youth as they connect and grow together over the summer. Also, last week was Promotion Sunday for all of our PC kids, so just a reminder, all of our kids have moved up into the grade level that they'll be moving into in the fall. This means all of our incoming 6th graders are now youth. Speaking of those PC kids, signups are live for this year's Kids Camp. This year's theme is Start the Party, Celebrate the Good News. Camp will be July 8th through the 11th and is open to students K through 5th grades. In addition, we are looking for a few volunteers. So if you would like to help out with snacks or be a part of the classroom, head to the Kids Camp tab on the app or the website and click Volunteer. With summer here, make sure you have the Prodigal Church app downloaded and turn on those notifications. It has all of our church-wide and youth events as well as special Sundays. Speaking of, our Father's Day service is just 2 weeks away on June 16th. We look forward to celebrating all the dads. If you would like to give to Prodigal, you can use our app, our website, or the kiosks in the lobby. Thank you so much for your generosity, church. If you are newer to Prodigal or you just don't get our church email every so often, that probably means you haven't filled out our Church Connect card. So to do so, head to our app or website, select Connect, and fill out the Connect card. Thank you so much for joining us today, church.
You are loved. You are loved by the very hands that painted the stars and set the planets into motion. You are not a coincidence. He chose you to exist in this very moment. You are not a drop of water in the ocean. You are seen, and you are loved. You were handpicked by the King of Kings. He knit you together in your mother's womb. He knows the number of hairs on your head. He is your father, and you are his child. He delights at the opportunity of talking with you. No height or depth can separate you from the love of God. His love is endless, like the depths of the seas. It's a love that stands firm when you are at your lowest. His love is full of grace and compassion. You are loved without conditions. You are deeply cherished and loved by the one who created you. Take in the peace, knowing that you are a loved child of the King. Let that love guide you, empower you, and fill your heart with joy. His love has no beginning and no end. The love of God will always be. You are and have always been dearly loved.
Hello, Prodigal. My name's Nick, and I'm really excited to be here. My family and I have been at Prodigal Church for about 2 years now. My wife is Kyoko, and we got 3 kids, Atticus, Clive, and Ezra. We have a full crazy life. They all go to 3 different schools. Me and my wife both work basically full time. And so, in fact, trying to sermon prep, like trying to get ready for this message, I was with my son, my youngest son, Ezra. He's learning to swim. He's very excited about it. And everyone else had gone inside. We were at my sister-in-law's house, and it was just me and Ezra outside. And I'm pacing back and forth, like practicing, thinking about different stories to tell. And Ezra is just nonstop screaming at me. He's like in the little shallow end. Dad, watch this, watch this. And he'd jump under, and he'd come up and be like, great job. Okay, so then maybe I could, Dad. Yeah, Ezra, what? And over and over and over. And after like 20 minutes of basically getting nothing done, I just started laughing. I just couldn't help it. I just started laughing, and I was like, this is the season of life we're in. Little kids just constantly. He just wanted me to see him. Was that amazing, Dad? Was that amazing? Yeah, that was amazing. Okay, great. Oh, watch this, watch this. He'd jump in, he'd do it all over again. It was pretty special. He's a flippin' cute kid. So I'm happy to be here. The reason I'm even preaching actually today is about a year ago when they were doing the serve in Prodigal Church. They handed out the cards and I checked off kids. But my wife leans over and she's like, hey, don't you ever want to preach? Which is a nice question. I mean, I have preached in the past. It's been years, like 2 or 3 years, but I've done it. And I was like, yeah, I mean, I guess. And I was like, but there's no box for preaching. There's like kids or tech or whatever. And so she wrote in a box and wrote the word preaching and then checked it off. And John was gracious enough to play the game. And so here we go. All right. So for today, my goal is just to sort of tell you a little bit about my story. I'm going to call this the Me You Don't See bonus episode because I actually am in therapy, been in therapy for a few years, have had therapy times through multiple seasons of life, and it's completely changed and transformed me, who I am, my marriage, my family, my relationships, and really the way I understand God. Ironically, I'm probably using that word wrong, but Tim Neufeld, who preached here like 2 weeks ago, is my therapist, amazing therapist, by the way. And so I just wanted the opportunity to sort of share my story, like how therapy has affected my life, how it's interacted with my life and God, and then how the Bible has also played a role in sort of joining in what was happening for me in therapy. So this is the Me You Don't See the bonus episode. Oh, just so if anyone's missing John, I don't want you to feel out of place. I'm just going to do my hat backwards. So this is my one dad joke I get for today. There you go. Don't worry, John's not far away. All right. So why therapy? So 2 years ago, I turned 40, and I did not handle it well. They say that at 40, you start looking back, right? Up to 40, everything's bright. The future's amazing. Anything could happen. Then you hit 40 and you start looking back and you're like, what has happened with my life? This is not what I had planned. And that's essentially what was happening with me. And I was having 2 really interesting, very extremely different emotional experiences. So one experience was I had no emotion at all. It was like I was standing behind a glass door and these things were happening to me and I could see them and I was like, I should really be feeling something, like there should be a lot of anger or there should be a lot of like contemplation or sadness. And I was watching them as if they weren't happening to me, but they were. The other thing that was happening was the total opposite. The stupidest, smallest things would happen and I would have these enormous emotional reactions. So one example, my son, one of my sons, doesn't even matter which one, because they've all done it, was at night, got scared. He came in me and my wife's room. He's like, oh, I'm so scared. I can't go to bed. And I like start to panic. I'm like, I'm in my mind, I'm like, you can't go to bed. If you're scared, you should sleep right here next to us. And my wife, being the responsible, amazing woman that she is, does the thing that a good parent does. You're safe, you're okay, go lay in your bed, you'll be fine. And my son's like, no, I can't do it. And I'm like, you can't do it. I'm just feeding off of him, right? And I'm telling my wife, what are you, a monster? And she is looking at me like, what is wrong with you? And that was a great question because I did not know what was wrong with me. I was having this enormous reaction, like I was somehow torturing my son by asking him to go back into his room at night and go to sleep. Now, mind you, it's not like we live in this enormous mansion. Our doors are 6 feet apart. He could see me in my bed from his bed. I mean, this was not a scary thing. It's a normal deal. Kids feel this way. But he was safe. And the appropriate response was just go back to your bed. So I'm having a super huge emotional reaction to something that did not require that kind of reaction. And in the midst of all these 2 extremes, no emotion or way too much emotion, I was also just depressed. It was like, didn't want to get out of bed, had very little motivation. And I kept just sort of, there was this song I kept listening to. I had this band I'm obsessed with called Judah and the Lion. And it's all about basically looking back over your life and realizing it's not what you thought it was going to be. And I would like listen to that song on my radio and scream and yell. And eventually my wife is like, what's going on with you? And I'm like, yeah, this isn't working. You know, the things I have done up to this point to cope with really painful, weird, confusing times is not working. And so I got myself a therapist. And a good one, Tim Neufeld. I don't know if I said this yet. Preached here a few weeks ago. Great therapist. And so I began to see Tim. So the first thing that happened when I got into therapy, the sort of the baggage, I have plenty of baggage, but the set of luggage I'm going to talk about today is my religious baggage. And to understand sort of, and this is like the first thing that came up. Therapy was cool for me. I would show up to therapy. I started going week by week. I had done therapy in the past when I was younger, and I would just go like once every few weeks for a month. But when I went to see Tim, I was going every week. And by like the fourth week, it was clear I was gonna be there a while. I went home after the fourth week. I was like, I don't think this is gonna be one of those like short therapy times, you know, I'm really getting deep. And what was interesting is I would have these dreams right before therapy, and the dreams would bring all this stuff up, all these emotions and feelings, and then I would go into therapy and I'd just start tackling them. And it was exposing all these things. And like the first subjects that started coming up in my dreams and in therapy was some of this like religious baggage that I have. So let me give you just a little background of my story with Jesus. When I was a little kid, my grandfather was a Southern Baptist preacher, and he recorded a record. Look at this guy. Yeah. Oh man, he was a giant. He also was like an actor for a little while and a preacher, and he recorded a record, and a singer. His name was Bill Shackelford. I called him Papa Bill. He was from Texas. Amazing, tall, deep voice, powerful, powerful man. And really, as my child, my favorite grandfather, my favorite papa, spent all this time with him. He loved me a lot, and I really looked up to him. So I met Jesus in his church and was really pretty excited, passionate about it from a young age. At 13, I went on this quick missions trip to Mexico. I got back, and my church got a few of us up on front of the stage to like give our testimony. I got off the stage that day. I walked right up to my mom and I said, Mom, I'm going to be a preacher. And she was very excited. People in my church were excited. Probably the most excited guy, this dude right here, Papa Bill. Papa Bill had preached at lots and lots of small churches, but he always dreamed of being like Billy Graham. Like he wanted the mega church, the big church. He would constantly tell me if he had a big Sunday, how many people were in his church. He was striving for that, and he never got it. And I think when I told him I was ready to be a preacher, I think his eyes were like, oh, I didn't do it, but maybe you can, you know? He was shooting for me to be the Billy Graham that he could never be. And so that is where I started my pursuit. And I dove head in. I was at 13 years old, convinced this is what I'm gonna do for the rest of my life. So now I'm gonna just go through like a few of my greatest hits in terms of ministry. First greatest hit. At 19 years old, I was going to a mega church, and they asked me to be on the prayer team. This mega church was charismatic. They had 2 or 3 services, and they had all these prayer teams. At the end of the service, you go up and people would come up. You put your hands on them all over their bodies. You put oil on your hands and you rub it in their eyes, you know, and not in their eyes, but, you know, on their heads. And you pray for all the things, you know. Well, a 19-year-old had not been on the prayer team before, but I knew the leader and he knew me, and he was like, Nick, do you want to be? I was like, oh yeah, I'm going to be on the prayer team. I was super excited. And so once a month, I got to go up front at the end of the service, and people would come up and I'd pray for them, and all this cool stuff was happening. And I was like, you know, it was confirmation. I'm on my way. Like, this is the journey, right? I'm the youngest prayer guy up here. So that was great for like 6 months. Then I'm at home one day, living with my parents still, going to college, working part-time. I actually worked at another ministry or volunteered at another ministry part-time. And I'm sitting at home and I get a letter from the church and I'm reading it. It's like, oh, thank you, Nick. You're great. We love you. So glad you're here. However, we need to ask you to step down from the prayer ministry. And I'm like a little bit shocked. I had no idea. Nobody called me. No one warned me. And I'm reading, I'm like, what did I do something? What happened? At the bottom of the thing, it had my financial statement of giving. And they said, they had this equation. And in their mind, they had determined that there was a minimum amount that someone could possibly give and still survive. Like if they were giving 10% and still survive on their income. And if you did not hit that minimum amount, then it was clear that you were not tithing 10%. And if you weren't tithing 10%, then you were not really following Jesus and you could not be in a leader in their church. So they said, we're sorry, you've not given enough, and so you can no longer be on the prayer team. That was a pretty big hit. I was not what I was expecting at 19 years old. The crazy thing is I worked part-time. I made almost nothing and I was giving. But they didn't know that. And that was a pretty harsh hit. The second ministry hit was the worst sermon I ever preached. And I'm not going to go all into it, but I was like 17, a little bit younger. Somebody thought I'd be great for this like skater dude church where they were trying to get all these skater kids to like learn about Jesus. So they invited me over. They were like, these kids never listen. They never hear anybody. Anytime anyone gets up, they just ignore you. They're like, will you help them hear Jesus? And I was like, yeah, I'll do it. And I was all fired up. And so I get up front and I'm getting really excited. And it was just so stupid. It was just so stupid. But I had this idea that these kids aren't listening. Do you know what makes kids listen? Let me just tell you what I said. I said, good afternoon or good evening. My name's Nick. I'm glad to be here. No one's listening, blah, 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 blah. It's like, so I want to tell you about Jesus. No one's listening. No one's listening. Because if you don't know about Jesus, no one's listening. No one's listening. You're all going to go to hell. I said it. I mean, when I said hell, they were listening. I mean, at least I got that. I mean, it's not, honestly, even at that time, I'd never told anyone I'm not a hell person. I had this idea that it would get everyone's attention. It was a terrible idea. The preacher, the guy who invited me there, like threw his hands on his face. He like couldn't watch. He turned around. Oh, I felt terrible. Worst sermon I ever preached. Kicked out of ministry. Worst sermon I ever preached. These next three are a little harder. I started a ministry and thought that it was going to be the one that I went to for the rest of my life. I thought I was going to grow, like take over, become the director. I'd been there for 5 or 6 years in really, really, sort of important times of my life. And it became my full identity. Almost every relationship I had was around this ministry. And at some point in the midst of that, I began to have some theological challenges. Questions. I was like, didn't agree with everything we were teaching, was struggling with a few of these things. And I took it to the director and he was respectful and kind, but there was not room for disagreement, right? Like there was not room to teach differently than what they were teaching. He was trying to accomplish a goal and I was starting to get in the way. And so it wasn't mean. No one was harsh. No one kicked me out, but it became very clear that my theological stance and how I believed no longer fit with this entire identity that I had created. The very thing that I was supposed to do for the rest of my life. And it was by far the hardest thing I've probably ever done in my life, but I had to tear myself away from that organization. I had to walk away. And when I did, I felt like everything crumbled. Every time I'd have a conversation with someone, they'd be like, what are you doing now? And I would panic because I felt like, what kind of Jesus thing am I doing? What kind of excuses can I make? How can I prove that I'm still a good Christian and I'm still doing the things God wants me to do? And I had so much anxiety all the time that I gave up. I was like, I'm through with it. I don't want to do it anymore. I did the super angsty, like anarchy church thing, and I left the church and I did like intentional community. It was back when everyone was into intentional community. And me and a bunch of my buddies moved into an apartment in the Tower District, you know, the real gritty part of Fresno. And I was like, we're gonna do this right. We let homeless people sleep on our couch. And it was like, it was a mess. I mean, it was like incredibly messy. Lots and lots of really destructive, crazy things happened. Lots of beautiful, amazing, miraculous things happened. Ultimately, it was pretty good, but it was a very confusing time. It was not a ministry win. I was definitely not Billy Graham. It was better than telling a bunch of skaters they were going to hell, but not a lot better. And there was a guy that I was really, really close to, that we were like in this thing together. And he went through a mental health crisis. And I prayed for him, and I did all the Jesus things that I knew to do from the age of 13. I gave him all the good juice of Jesus that I knew I could give him. And I told him to talk to a therapist or a psychiatrist. I mean, it wasn't just like me. We pushed him and challenged him. But despite everyone's greatest efforts, he left this world. And I walked away angry at God, angry at myself, angry at the world, and completely and utterly confused about who I was. I got married about that time. Which, you know, if you want to make the first year of marriage great, just have a disastrous identity crisis. And I took all of that into my marriage, and I pushed and pushed and pushed for me and my wife to do major ministry, and it was very challenging. And finally, she sort of got on board with this idea of missions, and we were like, yes, we're going to be missionaries. And I'm thinking, this is it. I mean, it's not Billy Graham, but you know, at least I'm still heading in the direction. And so we go and we do a missions weekend, and it was where we were supposed to find out where we were going to go, and they were going to approve us to have this full year-long missions. And we sat in a group, and we were all around them, and they're praying for us and anointing us, and we're having this whole emotional experience. And then they stop, and it's this moment where they say, yes, we approve you to go on missions here or there, or no, we don't approve you, you know, we want something else. And if you can believe it, like every other ministry experience I had, they rejected us. They said, they didn't really reject us. I had a bunch of student loans and they wanted me to pay them off that next year. But in my mind, they rejected us. In my mind, it was like kicked out of ministry team, terrible preacher, you know, can't do anything. My entire identity's up in the air. And now even with my wife trying to like do missions, it doesn't work. These were all really, really rough experiences. And I have others in my life, but these were the things that kept coming up in the beginning of therapy. And so here is why therapy helped. There are two things that I did in therapy around all of this baggage that brought me so much healing. The first thing was I acknowledged what's happened to me and I felt my feelings. I know it sounds kind of cheesy, but the reality was some of those things that happened to me were abusive, and I never acknowledged that. Some of the things that happened to me were really, really sad, and I had never really acknowledged that. I had never even been angry that a church kicked me off of a prayer team because I didn't give enough money. Like that, that will make anyone livid. And I never felt those feelings. I remember being in therapy, screaming, using curse words because I was like so mad for the first time ever about something that happened 20 years ago. I needed to acknowledge what happened to me, and I needed to feel all the feelings. And as I did that, I was like finding healing. The second thing, equally as important, that happened to me was I needed to learn what I was searching for. I needed to learn the why. Why was I always doing these ministry things, pushing, despite a normal person would have stopped, you know? And for that, I have this great meme. I think it's called a meme. I might not be cool enough to know what meme means. I actually saw this meme watching a great little show called Married at First Sight. Married at First Sight. And it's where two people come together, have never seen each other, and you guessed it, they get married. And so this guy gives this poster to this woman, and it has this: you're loved, you're valued, you matter, you're worthy. And I read that, and I was like, that is my why. I think that's all of humanity's sort of greatest need. This desire to be loved, to be valued, to matter. And I realized that there's a 10-year-old version of Nick inside that was desperately wanting to know that he was loved, that he mattered, that he was valuable. And at some point he learned that if he did the right Christian Jesus things, he would get that. And it's nobody's fault. If my 13-year-old kid came up and was like, I'm going to be a pastor and I love Jesus, I'm going to affirm him. Like, that is what we do. But at some point, that was the only way I felt that I could be affirmed. It was like the thing that I needed. And what was even probably the hardest is it wasn't just affirmation from my family, affirmation from Papa Bill. It was God. I thought God needed me to do these things so that he would love me. For years of my life, I thought that God loved me because he had to, not because he wanted to. That he might love me, but he really didn't like me. He liked me sometimes in these small moments when I could earn it. And so when I realized that why, I had this really sort of profound moment in therapy where it was like I was talking to 10, 12, 13-year-old Nick. And I was like, hey, you don't have to do ministry anymore. You don't have to preach. You don't have to be cool with Jesus, if that's a thing. You don't have to do it. You are loved. You matter. You're enough. And for the first time, this is no exaggeration, for the first time, I asked myself, do I even like preaching? Do I even like being in ministry? I had never been able to ask that question because I'd have all this guilt and shame, like I'm not allowed. Not allowed to have those feelings. And I asked him honestly. And it was actually interesting because in this year-long period, 2-year period where I was processing all this stuff, somebody asked me to preach. They asked me if I'd be interested. And I was like, in my mind, no way, I cannot preach. And I felt so guilty and bad. I didn't know what to say to him that I lied. I lied to a pastor about preaching. It wasn't you, John. Don't worry. It was someone else. But I lied. I was like, I'm really busy that weekend out of town or something. Because I wasn't mature enough yet. I wasn't healed enough yet to say, I don't really want to do that. Sounds terrible. And I was afraid. I was going to fall in that same pattern. So I took a long time off from even trying or doing anything so that I could sort of re-explore whether I even want to. So those were the two ways that therapy played a significant role in who I am and how I saw myself. I needed to learn more about who I was, and I needed to learn more about my why. The last part that I think is just as important is how the scriptures played a role in inviting me to see and know a different kind of God. So there's this parable called the parable of the prodigal son. There's some people call it the parable of two sons. I like the parable of the good father. That's like my favorite way to say it. And it's what this church is sort of named after. The general story is this father has two sons. He's a farmer. One son goes to the dad and spits in his face and is like, I don't like you anymore. Give me all your inheritance. I wish you were dead. He takes the money and he goes off and he, wastes it on booze and girls and gambling and all the things people shouldn't do. And And anyway, so he does all that, and he's like lost it all, and he's just laying in this pig pen, and he's like, my life is over, and this is terrible. And he realizes he needs to go back because he can't even feed himself anymore. And as he's going back, he says this is the first son's problem. He's wasted everything. He's shamed his father. He's broken the relationship. He's got nothing to show for it. He's a total disaster. And he says, Luke 15, Luke is a New Testament story about Jesus, a parable that Jesus told. Luke 15, verses 18 through 19. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like the one of your hired servants. So he's like, this is it. This is the thing. He's on Married at First Sight with this meme, and he's like, I'm not loved. I'm not valued. I'm not worthy. This is what I want, but I've screwed it all up by my actions. And here's the father's response. But the father said to his servants, so the way the parable goes is he cuts him off. He doesn't even let the son finish his statement. He cuts him off and he says to his servants, quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. The best robe. So imagine this, right? The guy is a mess. He's been sleeping with pigs. He's stinky. All the townspeople are around. They know that this guy shamed his father. The father could care less. He runs over there. And what's the first thing he does? He takes his robe, the father's robe, all of his honor, all of his love and dignity, and he hands it. He gives it to his son. The father says, quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Okay, there's another son in this story, and it's the good son. And this son has done everything right his whole life. He's great, amazing, never makes any mistakes. And, and he has his own little problem. That son says, Luke 15, verses 29. So this is the second son. His brother goes and squanders everything. He's stayed there, done all this great stuff. His brother comes back. His dad's throwing him a party, giving him all this great things. And he's mad. He's jealous. Like, what the heck? Why does he get all the good stuff? And the son says, look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed any of your orders. So it's the opposite. The first son thinks, I'm ashamed. I have nothing to show for it. I'm not worthy of love. The second son's like, look at everything I've done. I should be loved. I should be worthy. I should be amazing. I'm perfect. I've done it all right. And yet he doesn't feel it. He feels like he's being passed up. And what does the father say to that son? This is the second son. The father says, my son, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. Here is the beauty of this story. The father's love and affirmation stem not from what the sons do, but from who the father is. This is the radical message of Jesus. It's what 10-year-old Nick needed to know. That his love and affection, his willingness to affirm me and say that I'm enough, was never contingent on anything I did or anything I didn't do. It's not contingent on how much money I make. It's not contingent on how I look. It's not contingent on if I'm married or if I'm single, if I'm a great Christian or a terrible Christian, if I'm Billy Graham or Nick Chandler, the construction worker. Doesn't matter. Because his love and affirmation is about how good he is. And you and me are his children. And when he sees us, he sees good. He says, well done. And I needed that. This combination of acknowledging what happened to me and feeling my feelings in therapy. Secondly, finding out what I was searching for, what my motivation was. And then finally, re-understanding part of this Bible story, this God, and who he was and how he loved me. I hope today that you have an opportunity to know this radical way of Jesus. It's totally different than anything else we experience anywhere else on earth. Nowhere else is love and affirmation given for free. It's always earned. And I know you feel it. You feel it when you scroll, see everyone else's life, feel like you don't add up. You feel it when you, like me, can't lose 10 more pounds or 20 or 50 more pounds. You feel it when your kids don't listen to you, or your job stinks, or you, whatever, the million other ways that this world is designed to make you feel like you're a shame and you're not enough and you're not valuable. If that's you, I'd encourage you to find a great therapist. And I'd encourage you to remember that the good Father says you're loved, you're valued, and you're